Chapter 2. It would happen at times, when Kristin had gone to rest already, that she would be awakened by folk riding into the courtyard. Someone would thunder at the loft door. She would hear Gout meet his guests with the loud, gay greeting. Serving folk went in and out. There was a clatter and tramping in the room above. Kristin could make out Ingrid's voice raised in chiding. She was a good child, that young serving wench. She would put up with no forwardness from any man. A roar of laughter from young throats greeted her sharp, ready answers. Frida squealed. Poor thing, she would never grow wiser. Not many years younger than Kristin herself, and yet the mistress had to keep a watchful eye on her. Then Kristin would turn in her bed and sleep again. Gout would be up next morning at cockcrow, as was his wont. He slept no longer of a morning for having sat up drinking ale at night. But his guests would not show themselves till the hour of the morning meal. Then they would stay at the manor the whole day through. Sometimes they had a bargain to strike, and sometimes it was but a friendly visit. Gout ever kept open house. Kristin took heed that everything of the best was set before Gout's friends. She knew not herself that she went about smiling quietly, as she heard once more the sounds of youth and joyous life on her father's manor. But she spoke little with the young men, and saw but little of them. Enough it was for her to see that Gout was happy, and a man of many friends. Gout Erlandson was as well liked by the small folk as amongst the rich landowners. Although the doom passed on earl and slayers had borne right hardly upon their kinsmen, so that there were farms and kindred whose folks were still most loath to meet with any of the Erlandsons, yet Gout himself had no enemies. Sir Sigurd of Sundebo had conceived the greatest fondness for his young kinsman. This cousin of hers, whom Kristin had never met before fate led him to Erland Nicolauson's deathbed, had shown him at that time the most faithful kinsman to her. He had stayed at Jorengard till nigh to Yuletide, and done all he could to help the widow and the fatherless young lads. The Erlandsons showed their thankfulness fairly and courteously, but only Gout made close friends with him, and he had been much at Sundebo since that time. When this daughter's son of Ivar Jesling died, the manor would pass wholly away out of the Jesling house. He was childless, and the Haftorsons were his nearest heirs. Sir Sigurd was somewhat of an old man already, and he had a heavy lot to bear. His young wife had gone from her wits at her first childbearing. He had now dwelt with this mad wife nigh on 40 years, but still almost daily he went to visit her and see how things were with her. She lived in one of the best houses on Sundebo, and had certain serving women who did nothing but tend her. "Do you know me today, Gyrid?" her husband was wont to ask. Sometimes she made no answer, but at other times she would say, "I know you well. You are Isaias the soothsayer that dwells in Brotveed, northward, under the Brotveed hill." She always sat with a spindle in her hands. When she was at her best, she would spin a fine and even thread. But when it was ill with her, she would pluck her own spinning to pieces and strew the wool that her handmaidens had carded over the whole room. After Gout had told Kristin of this, she ever welcomed her cousin with heartfelt friendliness, if it chanced that he came to the manor. But she would not consent to go herself to his manor. There she had not been since the day she had stood a bride in the Sundebo church. Gout Erlandsen was much smaller of stature than Kristin's other sons. Beside his tall mother and long-limbed brothers, he looked somewhat short, but he was of a good middle height. Altogether, Gout seemed to bulk more largely in every way, now that the two eldest brothers and the twins, who came next in age, were gone. Amongst them he had ever been quiet in his bearing. All through the countryside folk thought him a most sightly man, and he was comely of face too. With his flaxen yellow hair and his big grey eyes well set beneath his brows, his oval, somewhat full face, fresh-hued skin and well-shaped mouth, he was much like his mother's father. His head was fairly set upon his shoulders, and his well-formed large hands were strong beyond the common. But he was somewhat too short in the lower body, and his legs were much bowed. For this reason he always went about in long garments, except when, for his work's sake, he must needs wear a short coat. Though just at this time it was growing more and more the fashion for men who would go fine and courtly clad to have their garments of state cut shorter than before. The country farmers saw this fashion on the great folk who journeyed through the dale. But when Gout Erlandsen came to church or to banquet in his long green broidered holy-day habit, with silver belt about his slim waist, and great minever-lined cape thrown back upon his shoulders, the parish folk would follow the young master of Jorengard with glad and friendly eyes. In his hand Gout always carried a fair silver-mounted axe that Lavrans Bjorgelsen had owned in heritage from his father-in-law, Ivar Giesling, and folk thought it right good to see Gout Erlandsen following in his forefathers' footsteps, and, young as he was, keeping to good old country ways, both in dress, in manner of life, and in bearing. And on horseback Gout was the comeliest man any could wish to see. He was a most venturous rider, and folk in the parish boasted there was never a horse in Norway's land that their Gout could not tame and ride. When he was in Bjorgvin the year before, it was said he had mastered a young stallion that no man before had been able to ride. Under Gout's handling it grew so gentle that he rode it barebacked, with a maiden's hair ribboned for bridle. But when Kristin questioned her son about this matter, he only laughed and would not speak of it. That Gout was light in his dealings with women, Kristin knew, and she didn't like it at all. But she thought it was most because women met the comely man all too kindly, and Gout was open-hearted and forthcoming. For the most part it was doubtless sport and jesting. He didn't take such things hardly, nor kept them hidden, as Narkvi had done. He came himself and told his mother when he got a child with a young girl over at Sundbu. That was now 2 years gone by. With the mother he had dealt open-handedly, giving her, for her rank, a fitting maintenance, so Kristin heard from Sir Sigurd. And the child Gout would have home with him when it was weaned from the breast. It seemed he was most fond of his little daughter. He went to see her always when he was in Vargar. She was the fairest of children, said Gout proudly, and he had had her christened Manhild. Kristin, too, thought that, since so it was that the boy had done amiss, it were best he should bring his child home and be a good father to her. She herself was nowise loath to have little Manhild brought thither. But the child died when a year old. Gout grieved much when he heard of it, and Kristin felt it was a sore thing she had never a sight of her son's little daughter. It had always been hard for Kristin to chide Gout. He had been so sickly when he was little, and after, too, he had kept by his mother's side more than the other children. And then he was like his father, and he had been so steady and trusty as a child. Grave and like a grown-up man, he had gone about with her and done her many a well-meant hand's turn, such as he thought, in his childish simplicity, must be of the greatest help to his mother. No, she had never had the heart to be hard with Gout, and if he did wrong out of heedlessness, or because at his age he knew no better, he needed nothing but some gentle words of guidance, so sober and clear-witted was the boy. When Gout was 2 years old, their house priest at Huseby, who had more than common skill in little children's ailments, counselled that he should again be given woman's milk, since other means had availed nothing. The twins were then new-born, and Frida, who fostered school, had much more milk than the little child could drink. But the wench held the poor little being in dread. Gout was an ill-favoured child, with his great head and his thin, wizened body, and he could neither talk nor stand upon his legs. So she was afraid he might be a changeling, though the child had been sound and comely until the sickness took hold at 10 months old. Howbeit, Frida would never put Gout to her breast, so there was nothing to do but for Kristin herself to take him, and he sucked his mother's milk till he was 4 winters old. Afterwards, Frida could never take to Gout. She had always snapped at him, as much as she dared to, for fear of his mother. Frida sat next to the mistress now on the women's bench, and bore the keys when Kristin was away. She said to the master and mistress whatever came into her head. Kristin bore with the woman and smiled at her ways, though she was often irked by her too. Yet she sought ever to put matters to rights and smooth them over, when Frida had done anything foolish or had let her tongue wag too rudely. Frida took it greatly amiss that Gout sat in the high seat now and was to be master of the manor. Nothing would bring her to account him for anything more than a witless youth. She boasted of his brothers, though most of all of Bjorgulf and Skule, whom she had nursed, and she scoffed at Gout's short stature and crooked legs. Gout took it in good part. "Ah, to be sure, Frida, had I had you to suck, I had been as good a giant as any brother of them all, but I had to be content with my mother's breast." He smiled at Kristin. Often mother and son would stroll out together of an evening. In many places the paths across the fields were so narrow that Kristin must follow after Gout. He walked in front with his long-handled axe, so masterfully his mother could not but smile behind his back. She felt a mischievous youthful fancy to run at him from behind, clasp him to her, laugh and toy with Gout as she had done when he was a child. Sometimes they went right down to the washing place by the riverside and sat listening to the rushing sound of the stream as it hurried by, bright and swift in the twilight. Most often they spoke but little, but it might happen that Gout would ask his mother of old times in this countryside and about her own kin. Kristin told of what she had heard and seen in her childhood. Of his father and the years at Huseby, no word ever passed between them. "But, mother, you are sitting there shivering, I think," said Gout. "It is cold this evening." "Ah, yes, and I am stiff with sitting on this stone." Kristin got up too. "I am growing to be an old woman, my Gout." On the way up she stayed herself with a hand upon his shoulder. Lavrans was sleeping like a stone in his bed. Kristin lit the little train oil lamp. She had a mind to sit a little and solace her with the calm in her own soul. And there was always something she could do with her fingers. From overhead came clattering noises. Then she heard Gout climb into his bed up there. The mother straightened her back a moment, smiling a little at the lamp's small flame. Her lips moved. She made the sign of the cross upon her face and breast in the air before her. Then she took up her seam again. Bjorn, the old hound, got up and shook himself, then stretched flat upon his forepaws with a yawn. Then he padded across the floor to his mistress. She patted him, and straightway he put his forepaws up on her lap. When she spoke to him pettingly, he set to licking her face and hands, thumping the floor with his tail. Then Bjorn slunk back again, turned his head and looked at the woman. Evil conscience looked out from his beady eyes and the whole of his rough shaggy body to the uttermost tip of his tail. Kristin smiled quietly and made as though she didn't see. Then the dog jumped up on her bed and curled himself up by the footboard. After a while she blew out the lamp, snuffed the wick and dropped the snuff down into the oil. From outside, through the little window pane, the twilight of the summer night showed dimly. Kristin said over the last prayers for the day, undressed quietly, and crept into bed. She settled the pillows snugly about her breast and shoulders, and the old hound nestled into her back. Soon after, she fell asleep. Bishop Halvard had made Sira Dag his steward in the parish, and from him Gout had bought the bishop's tithes for the next 3 years. He bought hides and foodstuffs in the parish too, and in winter, when the sleighing was good, he sent the wares to Ramsdal and on to Bjorgvin in the spring by ship. Kristin didn't like very much these dealings of her sons. She herself had always sold at Hamar, for so both her father and Simon Anderson had done. But Gout had joined with his brother-in-law, Gerlach Paus, in a kind of trading fellowship, and Gerlach was a stirring trader and was near of kin to many of the richest German merchants in Bjorgvin. Erland's daughter, Margaret, and her husband had come to Jorengard the summer after her father's death. They made great offerings to the church for his soul's weal. When Margaret was a young maid at home at Huseby, there had been scant friendship between her and her stepmother, and she had cared but little then about her small half-brothers. Now she was 30 years old, and had had no children of her marriage. Now she showed her comely grown-up brothers much sisterly love, and it was she who brought about the understanding between her husband and Gout. Margaret was still fair, but she was grown so big and stout that Kristin thought she had never seen so huge a woman. But all the more room there was for silver plates upon her belt, and a brooch as big as a small hand-shield adorned most fitly the space between her broad breasts. Her mighty body was ever decked out, like an altar, with the most costly stuffs and fairly gilt metal. Gerlach Tidekinson seemed to prize his wife exceeding highly. The year before, Gout had visited his sister and brother-in-law in Bjorgvin at the time of the spring meetings, and in the autumn he crossed the fells with a drove of horses which he sold there. That journey brought him so much gain that Gout swore he would do the like again next autumn. Kristin thought it was well to let him have his way in this. Perhaps he had something of his father's thirst for travel in his blood. He would settle down when he grew older. When his mother saw that he was impatient to get away, she herself hastened his going. The year before he had had to make his way home over the fells after the winter storms had set in. So he set forth one fair morning of sunshine just after Bartholomew's Mass. It was the time for killing goats, and the whole manor smelt of oiled goat's flesh. The folk had eaten their fill and were happy. All summer long they had not tasted fresh meat save on the highest holy days, but now for many days they had had the savoury meat and rich fatty broth both at the morning and the evening meal. Kristin was tired but in good spirits after the first great slaughtering and sausage-making of the year, as she stood up on the highway and waved the fall of her coif after Gout and his train. It was brave to look on, fine horses, blithe young men who rode with shining weapons and jingling harness. The high bridge, when they came to it, resounded with the hoofbeats. Gout turned in his saddle and waved back with his hat, and Kristin waved again with her dizzy little cry of gladness and pride. Soon after winter night, rain and sleet set in on the lowlands, storm and snow on the fells. Kristin was somewhat uneasy for Gout, who had not yet come back. But, truth to tell, she was never so fearful for him as she had been for the others. She had faith in this son's fortune. A week later, Kristin was coming from the byre late in the evening, when she was aware of some horsemen up by the manor gate. The mist billowed like white smoke in front of the lantern she bore. She went upward in the rain to meet the troop of dark-clad men in furs. was it not, Gout? It was not usual that strangers would come so late. Then she saw that the first rider was Sir Sigurd of Sundbu. He lighted down from his horse with somewhat of an old man's stiffness. "I bring you tidings of Gout, Kristin," said the knight when they greeted one another. "He came to Sundbu yesterday." It was so dark where they stood that she could not make out his look, but his voice was so strange. And as he went towards the door of the hall house, he bade his henchman follow Kristin's stable boy to the men's lodging. She grew fearful as he said no more, but she asked calmly enough when they stood alone together in the room, "What manner of tidings are they then, kinsman? Is he sick, since he didn't come home with you?" "No, Gout is as well as ever I saw him, but his company was weary." He blew the froth off the bowl of ale that Kristin handed him, drank and praised the ale. "A good regale for him that bears good tidings," said the mistress, smiling. "Ah, let us hear what you will have to say when you have heard my news to an end," he said most ruefully. "He did not come alone this time, your son." Kristin stood waiting. "He has with him the daughter of Helg of Hovland. It seems that he has taken this maid, taken her from her father by the strong hand." Kristin still said nothing, but she sat down on the bench in front of him. Her mouth was pinched with close-pressed lips. "Gout begged me to come here. He feared, I think, you would not be happy with this news. He bade me tell you this, and now I have done it," Sir Sigurd ended weakly. "You must tell me all that you know of this matter, Sigurd," Kristin asked calmly. Sir Sigurd did so, in a rambling, unclear fashion with much beating about the bush. It was clear he was himself much dismayed at Gout's deed, but this much Kristin made out from his tale. Gout must have met the maid last year at Bjorgvin. Jofrid was her name. Oh no, she was not betrothed to anyone. But Gout had seen, perhaps, it would be no avail for him to speak of the maid to her kinsman. Helg of Hovland was passing rich, of the house that bore the name Duke, and had their estates mostly in Voss. So the devil had tempted the two young folk. Sir Sigurd wriggled in his clothes and scratched his head as though he were lousy all over. So, in summer, when Kristin believed that Gout was at Sundbu and was out hunting with Sir Sigurd after the two big bears among the Sæter hills, he had crossed the mountains to Søn. Jofrid was there with a wedded sister. Helg had 3 daughters and no son. Sigurd groaned miserably. Yes, he had promised Gout to say nothing of it then. It was true he had known the boy was after a maid, but how could he dream that it was anything so witless Gout had in mind? "Ah, he will have to pay dear for this, my son," said Kristin. Her face was set and calm. Sigurd said the winter was setting in now in earnest. The roads would be scarce passable, and when the Hovland men got time to think over the matter, perhaps they would think it were best Gout were given Jofrid with her kinsman's consent, since she was his already. "But what if they don't think so? If they crave vengeance for the rape of their woman?" Sir Sigurd twisted and scratched worse than ever. "It is a felony, probably," he said low. I don't know exactly." Kristin was silent. So Sigurd went on in a pleading voice. "Gout said that he was sure you would give them a loving welcome. He said for sure you were not so old that you had forgotten. I think he meant, you know, that you got the husband you had set your heart on." Kristin nodded. "She is the fairest child I have seen all my days, Kristin," said Sigurd warmly. His eyes grew wet. "It is an ill thing that the devil's lure has led Gaut astray into this misdoing, but I hope you will welcome these two poor children in a friendly way." Kristin nodded again. The country lay soaking wet, wan and black under drenching rain showers, when Gaut rode into the courtyard next day about the middle of the afternoon. Kristin felt a cold sweat damp her brow as she leaned forward under the door lintel to look. There stood Gaut, lifting a woman in a dark hooded cloak from off her horse. She was small of stature, reaching barely to the man's shoulder. Gaut would have taken her hand and led her forward, but she pushed him aside and went alone to meet Kristin. Gaut set to greeting the housecarls and giving orders to the men who had been with him. When he looked again towards the two before the house door, Kristin stood holding the stranger girl by both hands. Gaut sprang towards them with a glad greeting on his lips. In the outer room, Sir Sigurd took him by the shoulder and patted him right fatherly, puffing and panting now that the strain was at an end. Kristin had been taken unawares when the girl lifted a face so white and so lovely under the dripping hood of her cloak. And she was so young and small as a very child. When the stranger woman said, "I don't expect you to welcome me, Gaut's mother, but now are all doors but this barred against me. If you will but suffer me here in your manor, mistress, I shall not forget that I am come hither without goods and without honour, with nothing but goodwill to serve you and Gaut, my master." Then Kristin had taken both the girl's hands before she herself knew it. "God forgive the wrong my son has done you, my fair child. Come in, Jofrid, come in. God help you both, as sure as I will help you all I can." Truly she felt, the moment after, that perhaps she had been somewhat overwarm in her greeting to this woman she did not know. But now had Jofrid laid aside her outer garments. Her heavy winter dress of sea-blue, homespun wadmal was dripping wet around the bottom and on the shoulders where the rain had soaked clean through her cloak. And there was a sad, gentle dignity about this childlike girl. She bore her little dusky head graciously, bent a little forward, and two thick coal-black plaits hung down below her waist. Kristin took Jofrid lovingly by the hand and led her to the warmest place on the bench by the fireplace wall. "You must be cold." Gaut came forward and took his mother vehemently in his arms. "Mother, things must go as they are doomed to go. Have you ever seen a maid so fair as my Jofrid? I had to have her, whatever it might cost me. And you will be good to her, my dearest mother." Jofrid Helgasdatter was indeed lovely. Kristin could not take her eyes off her. She was short in stature, broad across the shoulders and the hips, but round and fairly fashioned. And her skin showed so soft and clear that she was fair in despite of her dead white hue. Short and broad were the features of her face, but the cheeks and the wide strong arch of the chin made it, too, comely, and she had a wide, thin-lipped and bright red mouth with small even teeth, like child's milk teeth. And when she lifted her heavy eyelids, her clear grey-green eyes were like shining stars under her long black lashes. Black hair, light eyes. Kristin had thought those the fairest of all ever since first she saw Erland. Most of her own sons had them. Kristin set Jofrid in a place on the women's bench by her own side. She sat dainty and bashful amid the strange housefolk, ate little, and blushed brightly every time that Gaut drank to her during the meal. His face shone with pride and feverish happiness as he sat there in his high seat. In honour of her son's homecoming, Kristin had spread a cloth upon the board and set forth 2 wax candles in candlesticks of gilded copper. Gaut and Sir Sigurd drank to each other without cease, and the old knight grew more and more wrought up, laid his arm round Gaut's shoulder, and vowed to plead his cause with his rich kinsman, aye, with King Magnus himself. It would go hard, but he would bring Gaut at one with the maid's affronted kinsfolk. Sigurd Eldjarn himself had no enemy. It was his father's shrewish temper and his own mishap in marriage that had made him so lonely. At the last Gaut sprang up with the horn in his hand. "How proper a man he is," thought Kristin, "and how like to her father." It was thus her father had been at the beginning of a drinking bout, aglow with joy of life, erect and hearty. Now has it so happened with me and this woman, Jofrid Helgasdatter, that this day we are drinking our home-coming ale, and have yet to drink our bride ale hereafter, if God will grant us such good fortune. You, Sigurd, we thank for kinsmanly faithfulness, and you, mother, that you have welcomed us, as I expected you would, out of your true motherly heart. For we brothers oft times said amongst us, you seem to us to be the most great-minded of women and the kindest of mothers. Therefore do I beg that you will honour us yet further, and yourself make our bridal bed so fair and stately that I may pray Jofrid without shame to sleep therein with me, and that you yourself lead Jofrid to the loft, that she may come to bed in the most seemly way, seeing that she has no mother living nor kinswomen here." Sir Sigurd was well on in drink now. He broke into a laugh. "But you slept together in the loft at my house. I knew no better. I thought you two had lain in one bed before." Gaut tossed his golden mane loftily. "Aye, kinsman, but this is the first night Jofrid will sleep in my arms, here in her own manor, if God so will. But you good folk, I pray, to drink and be merry tonight. Now you have seen her who shall be my wife and mistress of Jorengard. She and no other woman, I swear it by God our Lord and my Christian faith. I look to you to honour her, all of you, both men and women, and I look that you, my men, will help me to hold and guard her as befits men of metal." Amid the shouting and uproar that followed Gaut's speech, Kristin slipped from the board and whispered to Ingrid to come with her up to the loft. Lavransbjorgulfsson's stately upper hall had fared ill in the years the Erlandssons were housed there. Kristin had had no mind to throw away anything else than the most needful and the coarsest of bed gear and loosed furnishings on the reckless lads, and she seldom had the hall cleaned out, for it was not worth the trouble. Gaut and his friends brought in dirt and litter as fast as she had got it swept out. There was a clinging smell as of menfolk who had come in and flung themselves down upon the beds, wet and sweat-drenched and dirty from the forest or the farm, a smell of the stable and of leathern clothes and wet hounds. Now, hastily, Kristin and the serving woman swept the room and set it to rights as best they could, and the mistress brought in fine bed gear, coverlids and pillows, burned a juniper to rid the smell, and set the silvern beaker with the last drop of wine she had in the house, wheaten cakes, and a wax taper in a metal candlestick on a little board, and moved it close to the bed. It was as fine here now as she could make it with such short warning. On the boarded wall by the closet weapons were hanging, Erland's heavy two-handed battle sword, and the smaller sword he was wont to wear, broad axes and firewood axes, and Bjorgulf's and Narkvi's light hand axes hung there still. There too were 2 small axes which the boys seldom used, for that they thought them too light. But with them had her father trimmed and fashioned all kinds of carpentry, so well and surely that it was only for finishing he needed to go over the work with gouge and knife. Kristin bore the axes into the closet and laid them in Erland's chest, where were his bloody shirt and the axe he had in his hand when he got his death wound. When Gout, laughing, bade Lavrans to light the bride up to the loft, the boy was both shamefaced and proud. Kristin saw that Lavrans understood well enough that his brother's lawless wedding was a perilous game, but he was dizzied and wrought up by these strange happenings, and he gazed with sparkling eyes at Gout and his fair bride. On the stairs to the loft the candle blew out. Jofrid said to Kristin, "Gout should not have craved this of you, even though he was drunk. Go no farther with me, mistress. Fear not that I shall forget I am an erring woman, broken away from my kinsfolk's word." "I am not too good to serve you," said Kristin, "until my son has made amends for his sin against you, and you can call me mother-in-law with right. Sit down that I may comb out your hair. It is beautiful, child, your hair." But when the household had gone to rest and Kristin lay in her bed, she felt again somewhat of disquiet. Unwittingly she had been drawn on to say more to this Jofrid than she was sure she meant, yet. But the girl was so young, and she showed so clearly she did not crave to be judged as better than she was, a child who had fled away from honour and duty. So this was how it looked when folk had their bridal ride and home-faring come before the wedding. Kristin sighed. Once she too had been willing to venture this for Erland, but she knew not whether she had dared if his mother had been dwelling at Huseby. No, she would not make things worse for the child up there. Sir Sigurd was still staggering about the hall. He was to sleep with Lavrans, talking somewhat mistily but with the heartiest goodwill of the two young folk. He would spare nothing that might help them to a good ending of this perilous venture. The day after, Jofrid showed Gout's mother what she had brought with her to the manor. 2 leathern sacks of clothes. In a little casket of walrus ivory she had her trinkets. As if she had read Kristin's thoughts, Jofrid said that all these things were her own. She had got them either as gifts or in heritage, for the most from her mother. She had taken nothing that was her father's. Kristin sat sorrowful, her cheek upon her hand. That night, long ages ago, when she herself gathered together her precious things in a casket that she might steal from home. Most of what she had laid together were gifts from the father and mother she had beshamed in secret, and was planning to grieve and dishonour in full light of day. But if these were Jofrid's own possessions and her heritage in trinkets alone from her mother, she must come from a most wealthy home. Kristin reckoned the gear she saw here to be worth more than 30 marks pure silver. The scarlet dress alone, with white fur and silver clasps, and the silk-lined cape that belonged to it, had cost 10 to 12 marks at the least. And if the maid's father would come to an accord with Gout, it would be good and well, but by no reckoning could he be accounted an even match for this woman. And should Helg press the matter home against Gout as hardly as he had the right and the power to do, then things looked black indeed. "This ring," said Jofrid, "my mother wore all the time. If you will take it, mistress, at my hands, then I shall know you judge me not so hardly as a good and high-born lady might." "Nay, then 'twere like I should strive to stand to you in a mother's stead," said Kristin, smiling, and slipped the ring upon her finger. It was a little silver ring set with a fair white agate, and Kristin thought the child must hold it dear above its worth, since it reminded her of her mother. "I think it is but reason I should give you a gift in return." She fetched her casket and brought forth the gold ring set with sapphires. "This ring his father laid upon my bed when I had brought Gout into the world." Jofrid took the ring and kissed her hand. But I had thought to beg another gift in return from you, mother." She smiled so winningly. "Don't be afraid that gout has brought home a slothful and handless woman. But I have no fitting workday dress. Give me an old one of yours, and grudge me not the right to help you. Perhaps then you will like me better than I can look that you should now." But now it was for Kristin to show the young girl what she had in her chests, and Jofrid praised all Kristin's goodly handiwork so understandingly that the elder woman gave her one thing and another: 2 linen sheets with knotted silk fringes, a blue hemmed towel, a twilled coverlid, and last of all a long tapestry with a hawking picture on it. "I would be loath that these things should leave this manor, and by God's and Our Lady's help, this house will some day be yours." Then it was as well they should go down to the storehouses. They spent many hours together there, and the time passed happily. Kristin would have given Jofrid her small wadmal dress with the inwoven black spots, but Jofrid thought it all too good for a working dress. Poor soul, doubtless she was striving to please her husband's mother, thought Kristin, hiding a smile. At last they found an old brown kirtle, which Jofrid thought would do, if she cut it short below and put patches under the arms and on the elbows. Nothing would serve, but she must straight away borrow a pair of scissors and sewing gear, and set down to sew. Thereon Kristin too took up some work, and thus the 2 women were sitting when Gout and Sir Sigurd came in for the evening meal.